Accounting for the state of my own field, rhetoric and composition studies, means looking at a set of milestones that reach all the way back to the Civil War and bring us all the way up to the current day. First, we begin by defining the current state of the field. This is something that we've had several different chances to do, and actually the first one of those chances was with the very first one of the assignments, where the known meets the unknown. Rhetoric and composition studies is the professional field which studies and instructs academic writing and research, usually at the college level, although we have seen in recent decades that this has trickled down to K through 12 somewhat. We're seeing advanced studies courses and advanced placement courses in English now being taught in 11th and 12th grade. Like most other fields in education, rhetoric and composition is reeling from the COVID-19 pandemic, with lots of instructors having to recalibrate the way that they interact with students and set expectations for those students. And for that matter, certainly we're seeing students having to recalibrate their own expectations of faculty members and coursework and exactly what it means to do school right now. This also accentuates what has been the first major decline in our numbers of students in our classrooms for many years. The field of rhetoric and composition studies generally serves large numbers of mainly first and second semester students. Teachers of this subject tend historically to be non-specialists, and this is an interesting quirk of the field. They generally tend to have graduate degrees in literature rather than rhetoric and composition, and therefore find themselves teaching a subject that they've had little preparation for teaching and might not have even wanted to teach. Faculty members oftentimes particularly resist having to teach remedial writing, for which they can feel especially poorly prepared. This can result in interdepartmental schisms between faculty members who teach developmental reading and writing and those who don't. Oftentimes within a particular department of English or perhaps a particular department of communications, we'll see what amounts to a kind of mini department that evolves of teachers of remedial or developmental writing. And sometimes the attitude can be that that is its own separate study, even though in reality the two things are directly and closely related. Whatever level faculty members teach, the relative lack of preparation can result in new teachers of composition often without realizing it, without knowing it, falling into an approach to the subject that prioritizes the product over everything else and can be really frustrating for teacher and student because it ends up being really limiting. It means that actually the student can't say very much, and as a result, the teacher can't expect very much, and that's not good for anybody. Even if instructors of rhetoric and composition do manage to get beyond that initial limiting approach, there's usually little consensus having to do with teaching styles within institutions and departments, and this can make it really hard for faculty members within those departments to have any substantive discussions about their classes, their teaching of their classes, and their desired outcomes. Next, we need to account for how we got here. This means collating a set of milestones, and as we've mentioned before, these are historical inflection points. You can get to the reading on what an inflection point is in the reading folder. Now, these inflection points are going to be the things that best help to explain how the natural progression of events led to this state of the field. Though our description of the field was not itself necessarily in chronological order, the rest of the essay will be. It will focus on the construction of a timeline of important events and developments in strict chronological order, right? So the chronological ordering of these developments and events will be the thing that gives us the necessary structure and organization of the essay to come. We begin with the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890. The Morrill Act of 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, was meant to aid in the formation of large agricultural colleges. And what they called agricultural colleges now are just the big sprawling colleges that we see all over really the eastern seaboard. Land was allocated based on the state's number of senators and representatives in Congress, which, like I said, proved to aid eastern states the most. This would lead to the founding of the sorts of large colleges and universities along the eastern seaboard that have set the model for modern liberal arts education, such as Cornell and Michigan State, just to name a couple. There would be an 1890 expansion of this act that would legislate that race could not be a significant factor in admissions. And at the time, that was aimed at the former Confederate states, but now has, of course, been really important to basic admissions policies all over the country. Now, this helps us to account for the large numbers of diverse students that instructors of rhetoric and composition regularly teach, as well as for the large numbers of faculty members required. And that's key in explaining why it is that we've got so many non-specialists in the rhetoric and composition classroom. Following that, we have World War II and the GI Bills. Now, the first GI Bill, again after World War II, was actually called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, and it provided benefits to returning servicemen from World War II. A more modern version would be passed after 9/11, called the Post 9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Act of 2008. And the particular focus of that act is actually a good reflection of what ended up being the focus of the original one, that being higher education and college. More than 2 million veterans of World War II would have their college education paid for through the initial GI Bill. They were often academically superior to their student peers, and understanding the chance they'd been given, these veterans put up with what was often overcrowding and overwhelmed instructors. They put up with a college and university system that wasn't able to keep up with the sudden demand either. Now, this helps us to account for the current size and educational model of colleges and universities, especially those that are public and or those that receive state and federal funding for students, such as SUNY Erie. And actually, the majority of our operating costs come from that federal and state aid. Next, we have the development of current traditional rhetoric. I've got comes and goes on the slide, and it is less prevalent now than it used to be, so it's gone to some extent, but it's certainly not gone entirely. Current traditional rhetoric, or CTR, to take a phrase that's kind of long and shorten it, is teaching based on what instructors know from their own experience as students, assuming that they, again, haven't had any formal instruction on how to teach writing. That is, how to write their own academic essays. Resulting instruction is product-based, the 5-paragraph essay that we all know and maybe dislike. In fact, I'd imagine that all of you were taught before you even considered college. This approach pays the most attention to standardized grammar, standardized style, arrangement, and purpose. Overall, we end up with an end product that has to be correct in all ways, but it's also an end product that's really, really limited because of all of those restrictions. This had the effect of limiting student-written expression dramatically, but is still often the default approach of teachers of writing today, due to how few of them have had that formal instruction in teaching the subject. Now, this explains the first and often default mode of teaching rhetoric and composition, which began in institutions of higher education, but has actually trickled down to the K-12 system, like I just mentioned. This also establishes the reason for struggles by both students and instructors of the subject even today. We as instructors would love to have our students write really interesting essays we never expected, but this current traditional rhetoric thing means that actually all the essays are basically what we instructed because we're being so restrictive about what they can be. Next, we have the publication of the book Errors and Expectations, A Guide for the Teacher of Basic Writing by Mina Shaughnessy. Positing that there are patterns to be found in student errors, Shaughnessy made the field and instruction of basic or remedial writing into a systematized field that people could actually study rather than just something that needs to be corrected higgledy-piggledy. Shaughnessy established that basic writers are not lacking or flawed in any way. They don't come in with something wrong with them, but instead they're showing the symptoms of a lack of experience that only makes sense because they've never written in college before, because they've never been in college before. Though some of Shaughnessy's book would be appropriated by the current traditionalists in their focus on things like grammar and correctness, We would see composition scholar David Bartholomew in the years after the publication of this book argue that all college students are actually working to become citizens of the higher education community and users of academic discourse. Now, this is the seminal work in establishing developmental or basic writing as its own focus within the field. Unfortunately, this is also, again, the reason for the sort of siloing that's taken place, where teachers of basic writing can feel that they are in their own departments instead of supported by other members of their English departments. Right at the time, Shaughnessy meant for this to be the sort of thing that legitimizes the study of basic writing, but actually it would go on to become a kind of a tool for making basic writing its own very specific focus within the larger departments that actually it's related to. Next, we have the Elbow-Bartholomew debate. In the early to mid 1990s, composition studies found itself at a turning point as a part of what's called the reflexive turn in the field, where it began to interrogate its own understanding of who the student is or was, and how this shaped the approach to teaching the student to write. I mentioned a reflexive turn here. This is a turn that lots of the social sciences made, where rather than just focusing on the subject matter itself, sort of the world outside of the field, it started looking at itself in terms of the way that it studied its subject matter and understood things. Basically, it's the same thing as all of these academic fields, kind of looking in the mirror and making sure that they had all of their own things straight first. Peter Elbow, who had been a force in the field of scholarship, specifically, in writing and composition and rhetoric, advocated a process-based approach in writing, in which the student writer didn't really need a teacher necessarily, but needed to be given the freedom to discover for themselves how to write academically. On the opposite end, or at least a different approach, came from scholar of composition studies David Bartholomew. Again, we mentioned him just before, who countered that the teacher is a necessary guide and translator for the student as he or she becomes a full citizen of the university world and user of the language of the university. Now, what this means to our milestones is this. If and when teachers of rhetoric and composition are able to go beyond the CTR that they naturally adopt as a teaching strategy earlier in their careers, oftentimes they gravitate towards one of the two extremes. That is, on the one hand, we've got the student process-centered pedagogy championed by Peter Elbow, or on the other hand, we've got the academic discourse-centered pedagogy that's championed by David Bartholomew. Now, the two of these things aren't completely different, but there are important differences between them. Now, oftentimes, this is the main differentiation between faculty members' approaches even today. I'm a follower of Bartholomew myself. I think that you probably picked up on this given the way that the rest of the course has been taught. Finally, we come to what is the post-9/11 baby drought, COVID, and trauma-enforced pedagogy. So here we go. This is a big one. Colleges and universities across the United States are suffering from a drastic decrease in enrollment. Though there's been no clear reason found for this yet, or at least no conclusive one, there is reason to speculate that it's due to the upheaval and Great Recession that followed 9/11. The subsequent reduction in student enrollment has brought increased attention to new models of instruction and to new methods for assessment of the course delivery and outcomes that we've been using all along. The COVID-19 pandemic, meanwhile, has meant a shift online, and with it, attention to the relatively new teaching approach called trauma-enforced pedagogy. Now, this is big. Honestly, this couldn't have come at a better time. This is recent as of maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. Trauma-enforced pedagogy posits that now, even more than ever, effective instruction means being aware of the effects of trauma on students' mental, emotional, and physical well-being, all of which, of course, bear a direct influence on their ability to study and produce academic work. What this means then for our milestones, and this brings us up to the current day, is this. It helps to account for the most up-to-the-moment state of the field because it helps us to be able to explain the kind of constriction that the whole field is feeling, again, because of fewer students enrolling in colleges all across the country. And at the same time, we're also helping practitioners in the field with their struggles and with the degree of pain and growth that the pandemic have brought because of the resulting shift to because of the resulting shift to remote instruction. And again, because of the feelings that are shared by students and teachers both of alienation and problems with mental health and emotional health and obviously physical health because of the pandemic. Now, the psychological and sometimes physiological traumas we've all experienced have been the reason that I personally have worked to be as flexible and understanding as possible. And honestly, I hope that these will be lasting changes. I think that as a whole, the field really does need to be just a little bit more ready to sympathize and empathize with students and teachers both.